Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in this afternoon to hear my presentation. My name is Bronwyn Ayre, I'm a research officer at La Trobe University, and today I'm going to be talking about a joint project looking at conserving orchids across the Victorian and New South Wales fire scar. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently recording this presentation on the land of the Wiradjuri people and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. Before I get too far into it today, I want to start off by saying a huge thank you to a large number of people, particularly our volunteers from the Australasian Native Orchid Society Victoria branch, as well as the Canberra Orchid Society, who not only gave up their time but also generously shared their local knowledge, to government staff for helping to facilitate access to lands and for providing us with support. And of course, I need to acknowledge that this work was funded by the Australian Government's Wildlife and Habitat Bushfire Recovery Program. The work I'm talking about today forms part of a larger project that includes South Australia, but you've already heard about that South Australian component during the symposium, so I'm not going to be talking about that today. But I did want to say a big thank you to all of our project partners for helping make this project a success. I know we're joined today by a lot of people from overseas, but I'm also sure you would have heard of the horrific bushfires that happened in Australia over the summer of 2019 and 2020. Almost 10 million hectares were burnt, largely along the east coast, from Queensland right down to Victoria. The map you see on your screen at the moment is showing the areas that were burnt and the fire severity, with the black outlines different environmental areas. The work I'm talking about today largely occurred in the East Gippsland area, right down at the bottom of the map, but also up across into New South Wales, into the southern tableland areas as well. We've been working on 10 different species of rare and threatened orchids that grow within that fire scar. 3 New South Wales leaf orchids, Prazophilum bagoense, Keltonii and Anubum, all of which grow in the southern tablelands near Tumbarumba. In Victoria, we've been working on 2 species of leaf orchids, Prazophilum frenchii and Prazophilum retroflexum. We've been working with 3 spider orchids, 2 spring flowering, Callidenia ancylosa and Callidenia tessellata, and a summer flowering Callidenia aestiva, as well as 1 species of greenhood, the blue-tongued greenhood Pterostylus aureophila, and Diuricochroma, though only the Victorian populations of that donkey orchid. For each of those species, we've been assessing their status post-fire. We've been collecting information on how many plants were flowering this year, herbivory rates, wild fruit set rates, a little bit of pollination data as well, and also collecting seed and fungi for ex situ conservation. First thing we did was go out with our incredible volunteers to do surveys. All up, we had 42 volunteers come out with us in the field, and we spent 37 days doing surveys. The first piece of really good news was that it turned out that not every population had actually burnt, and particularly for some of our leaf orchids, none of those populations had actually been affected by the bushfires across 2019 and 2020. Prazophilum anubum, areas in Bago State Forest where it grows had been burnt, but even a year later it was deemed too unsafe for us to go in and do surveys, so the numbers we have are only from the unburnt populations. While with Pterostylus aureophila, we were only focusing on the Victorian populations, but we did also stop into New South Wales to check on what the status of those populations were as well. And what we found is while the Victorian populations look like this, with lots of mountain tea trees, the one site in New South Wales where we were reasonably confident Pterostylus aureophila had grown in the past is now completely and utterly burnt out. We're not sure if aureophila was there before the fires, but it unfortunately definitely is not there now after the fires. A second piece of really good news was that we saw over 20,000 flowering orchids across spring and summer, even seeing a record number of leek orchids flowering in New South Wales. We think these high numbers of flowering plants is largely due to the increased rainfall we saw in spring and nothing to do with the fire, particularly because, as you've seen, most of these populations didn't actually burn. The 2 species with the lowest numbers are obviously Callidenia ancylosa with only 36 individuals flowering this year, and Pterostylus aureophila with only 48 individuals flowering this year. Particularly for the Pterostylus, there may be more plants in that population, but they weren't flowering. In every population, we put out motion-triggered camera traps to capture what large herbivores were present in the area. We were interested in what they were doing to the orchids, if they were eating them or trampling them, but also just any general damage they were having on the habitat in the area as well. We saw damage by native animals. This is Prazophilum keltonii getting munched on in New South Wales. We also saw Caledonia aestiva getting eaten by a possum. So if you look really closely at this image, you might be able to see the little possum has an orchid in its hand and is munching on it quite happily. And surprisingly, we even saw a native bush rat eating Pterostylos aureophila. Of course, we saw introduced animals as well, including wild horses. These horses are feeding in a population of Prazophilum annubum. Interestingly, damage from horses was largely due from trampling and not from herbivory. If you look closely at this image, you might see small skewers sticking out of the ground. In order to quantify herbivory rates, we marked out 10 2x2 metre quadrants in each population and tagged every orchid with a small skewer. We then came back 4 weeks later and assessed them for any damage, not just by large animals, but also by insects as well. This is a little caterpillar poking out of a capsule he's munched on. All up, we typically saw pretty low rates of herbivory, which was another piece of great news. The highest rates we saw tended to be due to insects. So with Prazophilum frenchii, we actually lost an entire quadrant of plants to insect herbivory, while Pterostylos aureophila, a lot of the plants we collected for seed collection turned out to also have insect damage as well, with caterpillars being inside the fruits we'd collected. We used those same quadrants to assess fruit rates as well, so coming back 4 weeks after we tagged out plants to see how many flowers ended up forming capsules. We actually saw pretty high rates of fruit production across most species, particularly our Prazophilums, with anywhere from 42% right up to 82% of the flowers producing capsules, which was fantastic. The two lowest are with our Caledonias. The Caledonia tessellata only produced 22.5% of its flowers turned into fruits, while Caledonia aestiva was only 2.9%. You might notice we're missing a couple of species from this slide, and that's because there wasn't a high enough number of plants to do an accurate assessment of wild fruit set. For our two Caledonia species where we assessed fruit production, the pollen deposition rate pretty much matches the number of flowers that end up producing fruits. We assessed this by going around and checking on flowers to see how many had pollen deposited on them, and for Caledonia tessellata that was around a third. For Caledonia aestiva, it was only about 6.7%. Both of these Caledonias are sexually deceptive. We saw wasps attempting to copulate with the flowers. But when we did baiting ourselves, we saw really low rates of insect visitation, suggesting that there's not a lot of insects moving the pollen around in these populations. Although pollination wasn't a focus of this grant, we did try to spend a little bit of time assessing the pollinators of the different species. We used the Raspberry Pi cameras you would have already heard Richard talk about earlier in the symposium, and we also just had incidental observations of what we saw while we were in the field doing surveys or hand pollination. We also did a little bit of netting in our annubum populations as well. In general, what we saw was that the leek orchids were being visited by a whole host of different insects seeking nectar, while those Caledonias had their specific wasp pollinators. In order to ensure that the seed that we were collecting was genetically diverse, we hand-pollinated flowers in every population, moving pollen at least 5 meters between different flowering plants. We also bagged leek orchids in tea bags to see if we could get pollination without any pollinators present, and all of those leek orchids did form capsules. Any plants we hand-pollinated or bagged in tea bags we then put behind cages to try and stop any herbivores from damaging the flowers, but as I said earlier, we still got some insect damage inside the cages, and sometimes it appeared that horses and cattle were actually removing the cages as well. They seemed to like using the poles as scratching posts. Despite a little bit of damage by insects, we still managed to collect genetically diverse seed for all of our orchid species, which is fantastic news, and that seed is now in storage at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. And of course, because we were working with orchids, we also collected mycorrhizal fungi samples too. They're also in storage at the Botanic Gardens, and we're getting them sequenced by some colleagues at Trade University in Victoria as well. But this is all really fantastic because it means we have an ex situ collection of seed and fungi for each one of these rare and threatened orchids. And in incredibly exciting news, I can now say that every single one of these species has now been germinated by the orchid conservation team at the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, which is really fantastic and a huge achievement. It means that we now have a viable ex situ population for all of these rare and threatened orchid species. In summary, there is a whole heap of good news that have come out of this project. The orchids were still present at most sites. There were a couple where they weren't. There were large numbers of leek orchids flowering and generally large numbers of most species. We rediscovered some new populations with the assistance of our incredible volunteers. Some of those critical populations avoided being burnt, which was fantastic, and we now have stored seeds from all species and we know how to propagate all of the plants. Concerns: there are highly restricted habitat requirements for some of these orchids, and they grow in highly restricted distributions, which is always concerning. Orchids are no longer present at some sites. One of our Pterostylis aureophila populations had no orchids flowering this year, and one of our Caladinia aestiva sites had no orchids either. And there were low numbers of orchids for some species, which is always a worry. Going forward, I really want to advocate for ongoing monitoring of these populations. We've just got a snapshot of what's happening 1 year, and some of these species, that's the first time these populations have ever been formally surveyed. So I'd really like to promote the idea that we need to go back and keep looking after these orchids going forwards. We also need to start thinking about understanding of pollinators so that we can identify some appropriate sites for insurance populations, because if we can grow these plants ex situ, maybe in the future a viable conservation action would be to do some translocations as well. If you're watching this live, I'm happy to take any questions now, but in the future you can always send me an email at bronwynayre@gmail.com or get in touch with me on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening.